Hello and welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts online program. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Margaret Ewing, the Horace W. Goldsmith Assistant Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Yale University Art Gallery. And I want to thank my colleagues at the Yale Center for British Art for the invitation to be in conversation today with Ellen Harvey. On the occasion of the exhibition In a New Light, Paintings from the Yale Center for British Art, which is currently on view at the Yale University Art Gallery, we invited Ellen to select a work from the show to respond to. The exhibition features more than 60 paintings spanning 4 centuries of British landscape and portraiture traditions, and Ellen chose Angelica Kauffmann's Rinaldo and Armida from 1771. I think we're all in for a treat. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We'll be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Ellen. They'll be answered at the end of the program, but please feel free to submit your questions at any time. If you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking on the icon on your navigation bar. In recognition of the land that Yale University is on, the university acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagussit, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. Yale honors and respects the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ellen Harvey. Born in England in 1967, Harvey is an American-British conceptual artist whose work examines such themes as art as a mirror, interactions between the built environment and landscape, ruins and the picturesque aesthetic, and the cultural and economic relationships that link museums, artists, and the public. In 1993, she received her JD from Yale Law School, and after practicing law for 3 years, turned to full-time art making. She completed the Whitney Museum's Independent Study Program and participated in the National Studio Program at PS1 in New York. She's known for her painting-based practice and for installations and site-specific works that incorporate engraved mirrors, glass, mosaic, and video. Recurring motifs in her work include landscapes and mappings, museum and archive works, ruins, and self-portraits and portraiture. Harvey lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. Ellen, welcome, and I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And I want to start by thanking the Yale Center for British Art for inviting me to do this. I had so much fun preparing for this talk. So before I start, a disclaimer. I'm no historian. I'm just an artist. So I come to you, so to speak, on the shoulders of giants, all the historians and translators who've written about Angelica Kauffmann and Tasso, with a special shout out to the Angelica Kauffmann Research Project and to the book Angelica Kauffmann, Art and Sensibility by the great late Angela Rosenthal. I've put a bibliography on the chat for anyone who's interested. And now to start. First of all, there is some controversy as to how to pronounce Angelica Kauffmann's name. I am going with Angelica, probably because I am half German. So some people call her Angelica, and there's also some controversy as to how to spell her name. So it's a free-for-all. I'm just going to go with Angelica for now, and if it annoys someone, I apologize. Why did I pick this painting? I got sent 63 paintings, all amazing, from the Yale School of British Art, from the Yale Center for British Art. And I have to admit, the reason I picked this painting is that I'd just been talking with Katie Hessel, whose recent book, The Story of Art Without Men, made me think that it would be interesting to highlight a woman artist. And of the paintings I'd been sent, only 3 were by women. So one I didn't know much about, one Gwen John I already knew a lot about, and the third, Angelica, was somebody that I had heard about a lot, but didn't actually know that much about her. I just knew that she had been incredibly famous in her day and then had been sort of dismissed as being too sentimental. And I have to admit, I was really curious to know how she did it. How did she become a superstar in her day? Why was she so successful? Why did her reputation decline subsequently? I thought these were really interesting things to look at. And as a half English, half German person who lives in the US, I was also interested in the fact that as a Swiss artist, she ends up being classified as a British artist. So I've always been fascinated by people who are sort of, so to speak, between countries. And I was also interested by the subject of the painting, which is one that I didn't know. I didn't know who Rinaldo and Armida are. You could see there's this sort of young man sitting rather sort of languishingly on this lady's knee. And I thought, well, who are they? And who are the two men peeping in the back? Because you can't really see. I'll show you later when I show you a more lightened slide of it. So it turns out, of course, that is a really famous painting by Torquato Tasso, which I will talk about in a sec. But first of all, let's see who Angelica Kauffmann was. She's completely fascinating, it turns out. And of course, this is going to be directed at people who don't know that much about her. So if you are a scholar of Angelica Kauffmann, I apologize. So the fun stuff. Who was she? Well, she was born Maria Anna Angelica Kauffmann in Chur in 1741 in Switzerland, and she was the only son of Johann Joseph Kauffmann and Cleophia Lutz. Her father was a traveling painter, by all accounts, not a very good one, but Angelica was an absolute child prodigy. Like a lot of artists, female artists of the time, you had to have access to instruction at an early age, and you had to really sort of show that you were really extraordinary to get anywhere. And she was, from a very early age, she was well known as for having a real talent for both music and for painting. And the family sort of travels around what at that point is mainly sort of Austria, because a lot of Italy is occupied by Austria. And she learns to speak German, Italian, English, and French fluently from her mother. And here you see her self-portrait at age 12. You notice that she presents herself dressed sort of in full court dress. She's like very fancy. She's making a real sort of statement of herself as not just sort of an itinerant painter, but, you know, a member of, in a way, the aristocracy, and she's holding some music. In 1757, her mother dies when she's 16, and she decides that her career is going to be painting and not music. Apparently, the local village priest warned her that there were some very seedy people on the stage, so she decided against that. And at age 16, she and her father go and, rather importantly, restore the paintings and make new paintings in the church in Schwarzenberg, in Vorarlberg in Austria. She's 16, her father and she are painting all these frescoes. And this is the point where she sort of decides to start presenting herself as this sort of simple country girl in a way. Here you see a self-portrait of herself dressed in what's sort of the traditional costume, the traditional peasant costume of the area. And from now on, she will always claim that she is from Schwarzenberg, even though she wasn't born there and she actually practically never lived there. But that's where her father's family was from. And in some ways, this is a kind of early version. This is just before Rousseau starts writing, and this sort of fashion for sort of the simple peasant becomes a thing. You can kind of start thinking about like Marie Antoinette pretending to be a shepherd. So this starts something that's going to be very important for Angelica Kauffmann going forward, which is this idea of self-presentation. And from now on, she's going to be just traveling with her father. This is her portrait of her father, which she did when she was about 22. This is painted in 1763. And they travel around for the next couple of years between Milan, Modena, and Florence, where she studies the antique and she copies the old masters, which is a big part of learning to be an artist at the time. In Florence, in the Uffizi galleries, she's not allowed to actually sit there and copy in public because it's considered to be indecent. So she's given her own room, but she's treated as a serious artist at this point already. She's selling her copies, she's making portraits of people. She becomes an honorary member of the Accademia Clementina di Bologna and of Florence's Accademia di Disegno in 1776. And so she's making a living at this point, and she's increasingly becoming the breadwinner for herself and her father. And the moment where she really, in a way, kind of becomes famous is when she paints Joachim Winckelmann, who is a completely fascinating person. He was a pioneering Hellenist. So he's, he sort of is the guy. This is when the sort of neoclassicism becomes the artistic style. He's the person who really promotes it. He lives in Rome. He's openly very homoerotic, and he is gay. He actually dies a couple of years after this portrait. He's murdered by a fellow guest in a hotel for reasons that remain somewhat unclear. And he loved Angelica. He wrote, "My portrait is being done by a rare person. She's very proficient in oil paints. She's etched it herself as a present to me. She speaks Italian as well as German. She is also fluent in French and English, and therefore paints portraits of all the English visitors. She can claim to be beautiful and sings to rival our best virtuoso." This really gives you an idea of what Angelica Kauffmann's modus operandi is going to be from now on. Kauffmann is painting people who are not only rich, but also in many cases celebrities. And she becomes a celebrity in her turn over the years. But at the beginning, she's painting people who are very well known, and she seems to have a real genius for friendship. She's an incredibly attractive person. She's incredibly charismatic. She elicits rapturous responses from people. And she's also quite savvy. So she's not just painting very famous people and then these paintings in turn, people are desperate to see what Winckelmann looks like. She also engraves it so you can sell it. So more people will learn about her. They'll be like, oh, who painted Winckelmann? It was Kauffmann. So she's aware of the commercial value of engravings. And at this point, she's elected a member of the Accademia di San Luca. And as Winckelmann mentions, she starts to become the kind of go-to girl for English aristocrats who are traveling, who are doing the grand tour. At this point, if you were a young aristocratic or wealthy young man in England, your entire education would have consisted of the classics. And then at some point, you would have been taken along with a tutor, sometimes called a bear leader, to go and actually visit Italy, and maybe Greece if you were very adventurous like Byron. But most of the time, people made it as far as Italy, and then your job was to see the great paintings and to see the antique sculptures. And this gives you an idea of what this world was like. It was a very masculine world. So it's not just that Winckelmann is, promoting this world as a kind of homoerotic world. It's also kind of very homosocial world. It's lots of men, and they're all going to Italy. And as you can see here, this is a painting by Zoffany. This is a little bit later, but it's from 1772. This shows the main gallery of the Uffizi. This is one of my favorite museums. I actually went here when I was 6 with my mother, and I've never really recovered. But if you look at this painting, you see they're all men. They're all very well heeled. They're all quite, important men, English men. This was painted for Queen Charlotte of England. And all the sort of greatest paintings and treasures of the Uffizi are represented in one room in the way that they never really would have been. So this is the clientele that Kauffmann is now starting to meet. But at the same time, if you think about it, this is also quite a difficult situation to be in as a young, very attractive young woman. This Rowlandson caricature gives you an idea of the kind of innuendo that generally accompanied a young woman painting portraits. And you can tell when you look at some of the sketches that are done both of her and by her at this time, that it was a quite charged atmosphere. And Kauffmann painted Benjamin West, who later became the second president of the Royal Academy, and he painted her as well. So but he paints her as picture. But I mean, it's a very seductive painting with her sort of, you're seeing her shoulder. There were rumors that he was in love with her, And this is somebody who definitely was in love with her. On the left, you see Nathaniel Dance's portrait of Angelica Kauffmann. And then on the right, you see her drawing from her sketchbook of him. By all accounts, he was desperate to marry her, and there was some sort of understanding between them at this time. So when David Garrick, who is the most celebrated actor and director of his age from London, is in Rome, he of course goes to be painted by Kauffmann. And he actually wrote a little poem about what the experience was like. And he wrote, "While thus you paint with ease and grace and spirit all your own, take, if you please, my mind and face, but leave my heart alone." Which gives you an idea of how sort of seductive, obviously, the experience of being painted by Kauffmann was. The painting gets sent ahead to London and it's met with great acclaim in the exhibition held by the Free Society of Artists in 1765. And at this point, Kauffmann gets asked to go to London by Lady Bridget Wentworth Murray, who's the wife of the British ambassador in Venice. And she suggests that Kauffmann go with her to London. And Kauffmann's had so much success painting portraits of British travelers that she decides to go. And she arrives, her painting arrives before her, and she immediately falls in with Sir Joshua Reynolds. You can see here that Reynolds, who was famous for basing his composition on famous old paintings and famous statues, here actually uses Kauffmann's composition in his famous painting, which is also in the Yale Center for British Art, Mrs. Abingdon as Prue in Love for Love. So he copies her sort of idea of having this chair in front and having it be this very direct, intimate kind of view. And the first person pretty much that Kauffmann calls on when she gets to London is Sir Joshua Reynolds. She opens she gets there in 1766. She opens a really large studio at the end in a couple of places, but ending up in Golden Square. But the first person she goes to see is Joshua Reynolds, who is the most famous painter of the time and who everyone wants to be painted by. And he's immediately supportive of her. So he paints her portrait and she paints his. And they both keep sketches of each other's paintings. The actual paintings themselves are purchased by other people, interestingly enough. And so Reynolds himself is not a fan of what he calls face painting. He really was much more interested in history painting and more of that later. But here you see him, she presents him and he's wearing this sort of Van Dyck costume. And he's being presented really as a theoretician. He's not painting, he's thinking. And if you look at the painting that he did of her, she's also not painting. She's sort of holding this empty page. And you get a sense, they both of the real sort of intimacy between these two people. And at the same time, this exchange of paintings is a very intimate thing. It's part of the beginnings of a great friendship, but it's also something that is public. So for example, in 1767, just when this is being done, the Public Advertiser, which is a newspaper in London, writes a poem which is called An Address from Britannia to the Celebrated Angelica. Hail, beauteous stranger, welcome to my shore, to liberty's fair isles her shrines adore. How justly praise thy pencil, charming maid, what wonderful effects from light and shade. And it compares her to Holbein, Van Dyck, Rubens and Lely. And they also write about her portrait of Reynolds, which of course is also widely distributed and engraved. It says, while fair Angelica with matchless grace paints Conway's form and Stanhope's face, our hearts to beauty's willing homage pay, we praise, admire, and gaze our souls away. But when the likeness she has done of this, O Reynolds, with astonishment we see, forced to submit with all our pride we down, such strength, such harmony excelled by none, and thou art rivaled by thyself alone. So she's saying that, she's suddenly being compared to the very best painter in all of all of England at this point. And this is an engraving of the portrait. So Reynolds is a celebrity in his day. Angelica becomes right away very, very well known. And she seems to abandon Nathaniel Dance, who there's been some speculation she may have originally come to England to marry. And he makes this rather unfair painting of Reynolds. Reynolds was famously deaf. He caught a cold, apparently, while copying in Florence, and was so dedicated to his copying that he couldn't stop, and lost the hearing in his left ear. And here you see Angelica looking at him kind of adoringly on the right. Here's another drawing by Dance of Angelica when she's jilted him. He's got his father calling on her, trying to persuade her, but she'll have none of him. And there's considerable speculation at this time that she thinks she's going to marry Reynolds. But that is not actually what happens. So what happens in 1767 is that her father comes to London. She goes to London originally without him, which is rather extraordinary. And then comes the real scandal. We don't really know what happened, because the only real accounts come from an 1810 biography by Giovanni de Rossi, who's a Roman art critic and who befriended her after her death. He wrote it after her death and befriended her at the end of her life. But apparently Kauffmann was deceived by a handsome, well-dressed man claiming to be a wealthy Swedish nobleman who was called Frederick de Horn, or called himself Frederick de Horn, who was apparently without money as he was waiting for all his belongings to arrive from Sweden. And then one day he comes to her, pale and trembling, and his enemies at the Swedish court were seeking his extradition, and only marriage to Kauffmann could save him because of her many friends at court. So they secretly get married. And then, of course, it all comes tumbling down. It becomes apparent, he starts writing to her father demanding money, and it becomes apparent that he is in fact not de Horn, but he is somebody else entirely. And he's already married. He's a bigamist. He has a wife in Germany. So, and he's arrested. Kauffmann declines to press charges because he would be otherwise executed for bigamy. And she's rather soft-hearted. And he leaves the country, never to be seen again. Interestingly enough, Wendy Roworth found some letters where he threatens to publish in English, German, and Italian a book entitled The Unfortunate Fruits of Bad Upbringing, or The Life of the Paintress A.K. But sadly, this book was never published. So what's amazing, though, is that Kauffmann has this terrible scandal. She marries this imposter, and everyone rallies around her. It's not mentioned in any of the it doesn't show up in the scandal magazines. It's in a couple of letters. Her marriage gets declared invalid. She continues to be received. She continues to be, painting the royal family, painting various people. So she's actually quite successful, despite the fact that she has this scandal attached to her name at a time when that sort of thing would be social death to most women. And not only that, she goes on to become somebody really remarkable. This is a time when Reynolds and most leading painters in Europe think that the most important form of painting is history painting. So these are paintings that show historical events, important events that are meant to elevate and educate people. They come from poetry. And she starts making history paintings, despite the fact that the history painting is very much predicated on the male figure, which, of course, as a woman, Kauffmann is not able to study. So this is one of her very first history paintings. This is Hector taking leave of Andromache, from the Iliad. And here we have that was received interestingly at the time. So Helfrich Sturz, who came to see it, it was exhibited at the Society of Artists in honor of the visit of King Christian of Sweden. He writes, in her figure and in her paintings, in her speech and motion, only a single tone is dominant, namely virginal dignity. Her figures are full of grace. But then, he says, she hints at the nude with uncertainty and fearfulness. Her men stand so coyly and silly, like dressed up girls, that she will never succeed in painting heroes or villains. So from the beginning, she makes this claim for herself as a history painter, just like Reynolds. And from the beginning, there's this sort of question of, can she really do it, given that her education is necessarily circumscribed because she can't look at the nude male figure. I think a riposte to this is her self-portrait, where if you look carefully at the top here, you can see she's written imitatio. And you might think this means imitation, but nowadays we think of it as imitation, as being the same as copying. But at this point, there's a real distinction between imitation and copying. Copying is just mindlessly copying, whereas imitation involves the mind. So you see something and you improve it. And there's no question that Kauffmann is seen as somebody who is up there with the very leading artists, because when the Royal Academy in London is founded in 1768, I think there are 38 members, I believe, she and Mary Mosner are the only two women who are members. They're founding members. And if you look at this painting by Zoffany, you get to see a bit of why this is such a strange position to be in as a relatively young woman. Because you see this painting, you see the nude model, you see all the men looking at the nude men. And then if you look up at the top right, you see the two female academicians who can only be there as paintings. They can't be there in person because it would be far too scandalous. If you look closer, this is a sort of cutout. You can see on the left, you see Kauffmann, and on the right, you see Moser. And to give you an idea of what this sort of social space must have been like, you can just take a look at the guy, Richard Cosway on the left, who's standing there with his sort of walking stick posed rather suggestively on a female nude statue. He actually goes on to have an affair with Mary Moser, who was a celebrated flower painter. And there isn't another female member, female academician for another 200 years after Moser dies. The Academy becomes much, much more, or even more, inhospitable to women. And it's interesting also to note the difference between the presentation that Kauffmann does of herself, where she's wearing this sort of classical garb. She's not wearing regular everyday clothing, and the kind of clothing that she wears in real life. So on the left, you can see her, she's wearing a sort of bonnet. She's very properly dressed. But by contrast, when she paints herself drawing, she paints herself wearing something that she'd actually never wear. These are really costumes that she's wearing. And here you can also see what the Royal Academy classes were like. You can see it's all men, and it very, very much privileges the male figure, which is why that you have something like Peter Pinder, who's a satirical poet who writes a lyric ode to the Royal Academicians in 1782. And he writes, Angelica, my plaudits gains, her art so sweetly canvas stains, her dames too gracious give me such delight. But were she married to such gentle males as figure in her painted tales, I fear she'd find a stupid wedding mate or night. There have been two versions of it that I found. So sometimes it's a wedding night. Despite that, despite the fact that her history paintings encounter some resistance, they're also a huge success. This is the Royal Academy summer exhibition in 1771. And if you look on the bottom right, where the sort of, which is the best place to be as a painting, you want to be on the line, which is where people's eyes are. Things that are high up were called skied, so that was a kind of seen as a insult. That's actually a painting by Kauffmann, and it's the return of Telemachus. And at that time, there were about 22,000 people came to see this exhibition. They each paid $1, and there were about 270 paintings, 15 by women. And Kauffmann had, I think, most years between 5 and 11 paintings, so quite a lot. She gets invited to Ireland. This is the only painting of hers that I could find showing a person of color. At the time, if you look on the right there, there's an anonymous servant here behind the Ely family. And at the time, slavery is still operating in a sort of gray zone. The slave trade doesn't get abolished in the British Empire until 1807, so a bit later than this. And despite her scandalous marriage, Kauffmann obtains royal patronage. This is an engraving of her painting of Her Majesty Queen Charlotte raising the genius of the fine arts. And look at the genius of the fine arts, because later there's a rather sort of scandalous painting that's made that uses this composition. And she starts making a lot of history paintings that privilege, in a way, the sort of female experience. She makes a lot of paintings of Penelope, here Ariadne abandoned by Theseus. And she continues to make a lot of portraits, which are really her bread and butter. This is one of my favorites. This one is attributed to her, so it's not 100% sure that it's her, but it's of the Chevalier d'Eon, who was a French diplomat, spy, and soldier, and a trans person. He was, you can see him at the top right here, fencing in female dress, and it was never quite clear which gender he was, but he claimed to be a man dressing as a woman, and he was a great celebrity of his day. And Kauffmann also, apart from all the prints, she makes tons of prints, but she also makes designs for fans, she makes designs for ceilings. Here are some of the ceilings, but she continues to encounter resistance as well. So this is a satire on her called The Paintress of Macaroni. A macaroni is a fop, like in Yankee Doodle Dandy, where he says, put a feather in his cap and call it macaroni. And here you can see, this is her painting someone. Again, it's making fun of this whole idea of a paintress. And yet her standing as a celebrity is something that at the same time is very much defended by other artists, interestingly enough. There's a huge scandal in 1773 where Nathaniel Hone, who's not a rather unsuccessful artist, submits a painting to the Royal Academy, which you can see here. This is the sketch for it. And if you look in the top left corner, you can just see St. Paul's. Kauffmann was one of about 5 artists who'd been selected to possibly decorate St. Paul's. It never happened. But there's a naked woman up there in black stockings, and all these other artists holding their palettes are dancing around naked. But the main figure in this painting is thought to represent Reynolds. And all these engravings are basically saying that Reynolds is just copying from other people's engravings. And you look at the little girl on his knee, and it definitely looks like the genius of the arts from Kauffmann's painting of Queen Charlotte. But she wrote saying that if this painting was exhibited at the summer exhibition, she said, I have but one request to make, to send home my pictures if that is to be exhibited. And there's a whole back and forth. Kauffmann only objects to what she considers to be herself painted as a nude at the top left, but a lot of people thought that the little girl was also meant to represent her, and it was meant to represent her relationship with Reynolds. You can see Reynolds. See the final version, the naked figures got taken out, but the little girl remains. It was never exhibited. So that was one way that one artist, who was obviously quite jealous of Kauffmann and Reynolds, reacted. Another younger artist called Richard Samuel reacted in a quite different way. And he made this painting, which was widely distributed also as a print. And it was called, as a print, it was called The 9 Living Muses of Great Britain. So you see, these are all famous women who, with one exception, made their living in the arts, and who were all, again, very well known in their day. So he's trading on their celebrity to try and increase his own. And this was exhibited at the Royal Academy. And not only other artists defend Kauffmann, but she also in a way defends herself. There is at the time a real fashion and belief that art should be not about imitating nature, but it should be about improving on it. And one of the stories that often gets used is that of Zeuxis selecting models for his painting of Helen of Troy. He apparently had the 5 most beautiful women come to see him, and they took a little bit of each. So this is Kauffmann's version of it, but it's quite subversive, you realize, because when you look to the right, there you have one of the models, and she's picking up a paintbrush. And Kauffmann also shows herself as design. She and Benjamin West are both asked to decorate the Royal Academy by Reynolds, who's the first president. And there she shows herself intently gazing at the male body, at a male cast. Of course, she can't actually see a real male body. But this is a portrait of herself. And then she also did one of color and one of invention and composition. And to give an idea of how highly valued she was, Benjamin West is paid £125 for his paintings. There are 5 of them. And she's paid 100, I believe, pounds or guineas for her 4. So they're seen as equals at this point, which is interesting because, of course, Benjamin West is considerably better known today. And people continue to write poems about her. You know, there's a wonderful one by George Keats, which I would read, but it's just too long. But it's all. But you can see her. You know, again, she shows, when she shows herself, this sort of sense of self-promotion. When you get a sense of how she wants to be seen, she's serious. She's Athena. She's dedicated to her work. And interestingly enough, this year in 1801, she paints what is often assumed to be herself, but is not entirely sure, as a Vestal Virgin, as somebody, you know, who could never be married. And this is actually the point at which she does get married. She finally applies. She applies to see if she can get her first marriage completely invalidated, and conveniently enough, the putative de Horn dies, and she then marries Antonio Zucchi, who is a fellow painter. He's from Italy. He's from Florence, and he's a decorative painter. And he is a friend of her father's. He's quite a bit older than her. And once he marries her, he stops painting, which this is a painting by him, very obviously based on Kauffmann's Rinaldo and Armida. And you can see it's probably just as well. He basically becomes her manager from then on. And her father is ill, so they end up going back to first to Schwarzenberg. She paints herself again in the local costume. And then they go to Naples, where she's asked to be the court painter, but that would involve teaching the princesses too much, which apparently she finds tiresome. So she decides to continue to be an independent painter, which is quite unusual and quite brave at this time. So she goes back to Rome. She becomes great friends with Goethe. She uses her portrait of him, which apparently he did not like. He thought he looked too girlish. But she also illustrates quite a lot of his books. And the philosopher and poet Herder also comes to Rome, becomes utterly obsessed with her. He describes her as perhaps the most highly cultured woman in Europe. He also, of course, writes a poem about her, which is called The Source of Colors, a portrait of Angelica Kauffmann. And he writes, "You paint what you are. From the fields of paradise, you bring an angel for us to see on earth." So even at this point in her life, she's just eliciting absolutely rapturous responses from people. And this is the painting that she does of herself to be placed in the Uffizi in Florence. They hang it up right next to Michelangelo, which is obviously a huge compliment. And her relationships are not just with men. So she also has this great group of very intellectual and interesting women, like Emma Hamilton, the mistress of Lord Nelson, the poet, a virtuoso fortunata, who he's shown here declaiming. And she makes allegorical paintings about her own life at this point. She makes several versions of this, of herself being forced to choose between painting and music. You can see the muse of painting is gesturing to the heights of Parnassus and saying there will be fortune and fame. And of course, music has sort of flowers in her hair and is looking rather sort of, I don't know, like it's a lot more fun, but obviously Kauffmann picks painting. And at this point, she's not even in London and she hasn't been there for over 10 years. But when the Royal Academy gets a portrait made of itself, you can see at the top, right at the back, this time she's actually there. But of course, it's funny because she's not even in the country anymore, but they still paint her in because she's that famous. In her old age, well, 61, this is her at 61, painting herself not idealized, but she's at this point a fixture ongoing in Rome. If you go to Rome, you have to go see her. If you haven't seen her, you've missed out one of the great sights of Rome. And by the time she dies, you know, her funeral, she has literally the world's best funeral. It's organized by one of her best friends, the sculptor, very famous sculptor, Antonio Canova. You can see her painting of him here. I think she's showing off a little bit about painting the male nude with the Hercules behind him. He organizes a funeral for her, which is based on the funeral that was given to Raphael, who was literally the most famous, considered to be the greatest painter ever at this point. So Canova organizes this funeral. He has a sculpture, he makes a sculpture of her hand, which is carried behind her coffin on a pillow. And her greatest works are carried behind it. Several brotherhoods, all the artist academies, they all process. There are over 100 priests. It's a huge crowd. It's considered to be one of the biggest funerals ever seen in Rome. So when she dies, she's still incredibly famous. And of course, to this day, she's very well known, especially in Austria. Here are some banknotes and some lovely postage postage stamps. And you know, in 2007, there's a Angelica Kauffmann museum opens in Schwarzenberg. So there's sort of been a renewal of interest in her, but truthfully, for quite a while, she sinks into obscurity. So what's the painting about? That's who Kauffmann is, who is a remarkable person. But what is the painting about? The painting itself is about this crazy poem by Torquato Tasso. This is him, age 22, who wrote this sort of blockbuster poem called Jerusalem Liberata, or Jerusalem Delivered. And it was written in, it was written in 1574. There's a little bit of confusion because he sends it out then to everyone who's famous, asking for their opinion, and he gets back so many responses that the poor man has a nervous breakdown and is in and out of insane asylums forever. But this poem is really like the Star Wars of its day. Like, everyone knows it. If you look on Wikipedia, there are over 50 musical compositions based on it. And why? It's because it's about the First Crusade. Nominally, but really it's about these sort of intense love affairs between the Crusaders and these various Saracen ladies, my favorite of whom is Clorinda here, who's a warrior. They're all fighters and very, very active figures. So it has lots of sex, lots of enemies to lovers, lots of helmets falling off, displaying beautiful hair and people falling in love instantly. But the one story, the subplot that's probably written about the most is Rinaldo and Armida, which is the one that Kauffmann chooses to illustrate. And the protagonists of that are Armida, who is a Saracen sorceress who decides to kill Rinaldo, who's one of the great fighters of the Crusaders. But when she looks at him sleeping, she rather melodramatically falls instantly in love and then binds him with flowers and takes him away on her magic chariot to basically her island of sex. And they just hang out there looking at each other in mirrors and having a wonderful time. And till some of the other Crusaders come to get their main fighter back. And you can start to see all these I mean, this is a very small selection. There are literally hundreds of paintings of this, but I wanted to give you an idea of how popular it was. And there they are, looking at each other, they're in love, they're looking in the mirror, and you start to see in the background, creeping in, these two other crusaders, and they show Rinaldo himself in their diamond shield. And suddenly, he says, he turned his glance upon the brilliant shield and saw himself for who he was, how tressed with dainty touches, reeking of perfume, his hair in curls and tassels on his vest, his dangling sword effeminate at his side, prettified. He's horrified. And of course, he leaves to go and fight on the crusade. Armida is very upset and begs him not to go. But when he leaves, she then raises an army and fights with the Saracens to try and beat him. They lose. And then she tries to commit suicide and he prevents her. And she says that she will be his handmaid forever. End of story. So here we have Kauffmann with the muse of poetry. So when Kauffmann paints this is like a clash of titans. This is probably the most famous poem. Goethe wrote about the life of Tasso. Byron wrote about the life of Tasso. Everyone knew this story. It's very sexy, very exciting. And she paints it. Here she is, being inspired by poetry. And what she paints is, of course, this. I've lightened it a bit. She's painting here the moment where they're on the sort of magical Fortunate Islands and they're just kind of having a super lovely time. It's just before Armida is about to leave and go off to do whatever evil sorceress job she has. And before the two lurking crusaders in the background recall Rinaldo to his duties. It's an interesting painting because it's the only one of Rinaldo and Armida that I've been able to find that was painted by a woman. And it was very popular. If you look here, you can see it was engraved, I believe, 3 times. There's even a really fabulous kind of little sort of statue made of it. There are lots and lots of people who could have cribbed this image. And she painted lots of other ones as well. But I think the one that she painted, these are some of the other ones, they're all the same, from the same story. But these are all the ones that that she painted that I know of. And they're remarkable, right? They were super popular. But why then did they become less so? And I think one of them obviously is oversaturation. By the time you're like on everyone's like fancy dishware, perhaps it's too much. But it's also the fact that the kind of neoclassical art that she does is something that kind of changes at the end of her life. You have the French Revolution, you have Napoleon, and you start having this real relegation of women to a private sphere. The neoclassical becomes much more austere. This is sort of the end of the Rococo, and it becomes, you start having this sort of like Jacques-Louis David idea where the women are kind of collapsed in the corner and the men are, the men are the action. And yet, even towards the end of her life, what's interesting is that Kauffmann continues to make these sort of crazy, gender-bending historical paintings. This is one of her later ones. And this is Achilles disguised as a girl being discovered by Ulysses. And that's sort of what I love about it. I love the fact that she made this very transgressive painting, and yet in some ways she hid the transgression in a kind of conformity. And I really have to say that I find it completely inspirational and super interesting. So I hope that you too will look at this painting now with new eyes.
Ellen, thank you so much for this fantastic story about Kauffmann and this painting. I mean, you've just given us such a great model for doing art history, for diving deep, and a reminder that, every painting hanging in the museum has all of these stories behind it. So thank you. I would love to, well, first of all, invite the audience to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A. And while those are coming in, I'd love to look at some of your projects and think about them in relation to the Kauffmann painting. And one of the first things that comes to mind is that, so you've given us this story about history and through art history. So Kauffmann's painting in the 18th century, she's looking back to a poem that was written in the 16th century about a story in the 11th century. And in your work, you're often looking back on history as well, and looking at the history of painting, the history of art. For example, in the New York Beautification Project, which we're seeing an image of here. So I'd love to hear a bit about this project, and also how you think about the history of art and its relevance today.
Well, I think that using the familiar is kind of a shortcut, right? So you can get it, and it's also a way of making something richer. So, for example, the New York Beautification Project, all these paintings are based on old paintings, but they're also all painted over graffiti sites. So they're about this question of who gets to be an artist in public, and what happens if you make the painting in some ways very, very conformist, like something that everyone would be like, oh yeah, that's obviously art. Well, maybe outside of the art world, but you know, it's also about this idea of like, well, as a graffiti artist, as a 30-year-old white woman at the time, that was also sort of an unusual choice. So I like this idea of saying, well, everything is not what it seems. And it's a way of, you know, you can get away with a lot. You can actually break the law on the streets of New York. First of all, if you are a white woman, which is an excellent demographic for that, but also if you are making things that people feel are extremely unthreatening. So I've always liked that idea of kind of, you think you know what you're getting, and then you're sort of surprised. So, you know, you could go around the city looking for these things, and these are all the stories of what happened in my interactions with people. Or you can make, you know, a version of the hot dog stand that you see everywhere in Washington, D.C., but you can make it be about the sort of the neoclassical architecture of the city, so that it's for aliens who come to visit. And so I've always thought it sort of fascinating when you look at history. It's so different depending on who looks at it. You know, when you're in DC, everyone says, oh, you know, there are all these pillars because of it's, you know, it's a temple of democracy. And yet fascists, Stalinists, the Enlightenment, the Roman Church, so many people use these pillars. So these sort of this aesthetic. So I think there's something about aesthetics that are common that I find interesting, because they're sort of cliches, and yet at the same time, they speak to people. People feel like they have an access point to them. So they're very inclusive, weirdly enough. And yet at the same time, it means you can smuggle in a lot of interesting ideas. Like, well, here we smuggled in the Alien's Guide to the Ruins of Washington, D.C., among all the other guides. So I like this idea of using kind of traditional aesthetics as a kind of way to secretly seduce people into thinking.
That's so great. And just a little bit more context for the New York project, New York Beautification Project. You were going around New York and finding these sites in the streets where there was, you know, where there was graffiti, and then adding your own painting on top of it. And then you created this map that people could then go around and look for these different paintings. There's a wonderful catalog too. That's great. I was thinking also about some of the compositional elements that overlap in your work, in some of your works, and in Kauffmann's painting of Rinaldo and Armida. For example, framing. Framing comes up a lot in your work, and Kauffmann has framed the subject within the landscape in her painting. So for example, in your project, the Museum of Failure, it seems like you're, and maybe you can show us an image, but you're making us, so this series of frames that with mirrors, one of which you can look through and see where there's not a mirror, and you look through and see the wall behind. there's framing, there's getting us to be aware of the act of looking, sort of bringing that very much to mind. Is that what your focus is here, in part, sort of focusing on the awareness of viewing?
Well, I'm very interested in the relationship between context and content. So I like this idea that that kind of context often determines meaning. So in this case, it's a sort of empty museum, which is all plexiglass engraved by me, that looks like an empty collection of a salon-style hanging of frames. And then you look through one of them and you see something and you think, oh, there's going to be a subject. And then the subject itself it's the same collection of paintings painted as a trompe-l'oeil painting. And in the middle, you see sort of the artist wearing what looks like you really get to see the sort of space of the studio. So I like this idea of being able to look through and to see what looks like a collection of mirrors that show you the studio, and yet at the same time, there's nothing really going on, and everything is not what it seems, because in the middle, I'm taking a photograph, so I'm obscured by the flash, and I'm actually wearing not an artist's smock, but really my pregnancy nightgown. And the aesthetics are all based on that painting by Zoffany of the Uffizi. This is a Polaroid of my the version of it that I bought when I was age 6. So I love this idea that things have different meanings when they're in different contexts. So like with the nudist museum, I used to love to go to museums as a kid just to see the naked people. But here you have, paintings of all the nudes in the Bass Museum, which I painted and copied, much like a sort of, I don't know, like Kauffmann would have copied to learn how to paint. But everything that's not naked is black and white, but it's over a kind of tapestry of contemporary nudity. So nudity means one thing in an art context, something else in a different context. And it's very interesting because, now we think about nudity in an art context as about being the male painter looking at the naked female body. But of course, in Kauffmann's time, it was much more about the male painter looking at the male naked body. So it's very interesting. You have the baby Jesus shows up naked a lot to show how innocent he is. And here's a little gift shop for the museum of nude objects. Again, which are they paintings? Are they objects? Are they souvenirs? It's all about the context and your point of view. And of course, I always think you have to reject a singular point of view, because that's one of the great charms of making art, is that everyone experiences it differently. Indeed.
I'm seeing we have a couple of questions from the audience, and maybe we're just about at the hour, so maybe we'll answer these two and come to a close. But Karen Lipsedge wrote, "This was such an enriching and enlightening talk. Thank you. I wondered if you could say more about the representation of the Black man question, domestic servant question, enslaved servant in a painting discussed earlier in the talk. I was interested in whether Kauffmann is merely incorporating the elements often found in paintings at this time, or if as a woman, she's making a notional synergy between those who were marginalized in society at the time." Do you have thoughts on that?
I don't know the answer to that. It's a really, really interesting question, because that I did a little bit of research, but as far as I could tell, nobody really knows if it was a real person or not, or whether it was just a sort of symbolic person. But given that she'd never used this device at any other time, it's not as though she's always painting people with Black attendants or servants or enslaved people. My guess is it probably was a real person. But that's just my personal guess, because this is the only one in her whole work that I've seen.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad you included it, and it's a great question. It would be great to know more.
Yes, it would. I mean, there's so much.
Yes. Another question from the audience, from an anonymous guest. Why do you think Kauffmann did not continue to be known at least as well after her death compared to many male counterparts? And how do you, as a prolific woman artist, assure you will be remembered?
I just hope for the best is the answer for me, because I don't think you can control the future. But I think a lot of it has to do with, as I sort of alluded to briefly, there's just too much information, but is the fact that there's an immediate change, sort of she dies just sort of during the Napoleonic era. And there's a real change and a real kind of idea that women can't be great artists, that becomes, even in some ways, there's sort of the 19th century, women are become much more segregated in a way. You start having this sort of idea that the woman should be at home, whereas in the 18th century, it's a little paradoxically, even though people are working together more, it's less things that you don't have this sort of idea of the man leaving the home to go to work. People work at home, so it's harder for women to sort of be part of the economy. So I think, and also she's moving in this realm of total celebrity, of people who are very wealthy. In those, women did exercise a considerable informal power in those sort of circles. So in some ways, that was a better space for women, you can argue, than the sort of revolutionary space where there are these women who are in the French Revolution, and then they are all cast out of the Jacobin society. And Napoleon is very consciously about, reestablishing what he considers to be correct gender roles. So I think that it's the change immediately after she dies, and also the fact that she was everywhere. So it was easy to be like, oh, everyone loves Kauffmann, I think it's maybe that as well. And her paintings are not necessarily to our taste. Like somebody like Artemisia Gentileschi is much more violent and intense, and you can see, like, as a sort of feminist scholar, that might be the first place you go. Kauffmann is much more of a stealth sort of revolutionary in a way.
Yeah, and it reminds me about one of our conversations when I asked why you chosen this painting, and you said something like, well, because you didn't like it that much, and that you hadn't liked Kauffmann because she's sort of too sentimental. But then, that drew you into all of this discovery. So I think, such a great choice, such a compelling story. And you're, showing us, we're seeing a few of these images of others of your work go through, which I wish we had more time to talk about.
I had too much to say about Kauffmann because she's so amazing. So I was able to do it in 20 minutes, but then I got overexcited.
Well, we are all benefiting from your excitement. So thank you again so much. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you to everybody for joining us. And if you're in New Haven, please do come see the exhibition at the Yale University Art Gallery. It's on view until December 3rd. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.